Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Worsnup and this is a JavaScript coding tutorial. Today we'll be working in a React app that has a Redux store, and we'll be using React Redux to connect our React components to the store. And specifically we'll be looking at this connect function. The connect function is exported by React Redux and enables you to very declaratively and simply specify which parts of a Redux store your component depends on. That's this first parameter here, map state to props, and which actions your component needs to dispatch to update the Redux store. That's this map dispatch to props parameter here. We'll be re-implementing the connect function and adding support for map state to props and map dispatch to props in order to see how a function like this might be implemented. We'll be ignoring merge props though, and we'll be ignoring options. And obviously, we'll also be ignoring all of the optimizations that can be made to this connect function. The React Redux library obviously needs to support a lot of optimizations in order to make sure that your React tree is not needlessly re-rendering. But just for demonstrative purposes and getting through this coding tutorial quickly, we're just going to get a functional connect function that supports map state to props and map dispatch to props. If you're not familiar with React and you're not familiar with Redux, then you should go and learn about those first, because without that context, not much of this tutorial is going to make sense to you. We're going to jump in quickly. I'm assuming existing knowledge of React, Redux, and React Redux. So this is our code sandbox. We just have an input field over here, and we can type into this input field. So we can replace foobar with another name. This input field, though, isn't just a normal HTML input field. It's connected to our Redux store. The value of the input field is being pulled from the Redux store using map state to props, and every single change event that this input field emits is being translated into a dispatch to our Redux store, and it's this onChange_name action. So when I'm typing in here, this is not just a normal input being updated, it's actually our Redux store. Yeah, Redux is awesome, although definitely overkill for an app of this size. But that's not the point of this tutorial. We're trying to re-implement the connect function. So we're going to make sure that we support map state to props, which is a function parameter. The function receives state and returns an object, and the object specifies props that should be passed into the wrapped component. And then map dispatch to props, the second parameter, is just an object where the keys are the props that get passed into your wrapped component, and the values are the action creators for Redux. So let's get started just by deleting the connect function, because we're going to be creating our own connect, like so. And so obviously we're getting errors already, but we'll make those go away. We'll focus on getting map state to props working first, and then we'll work on map dispatch to props after that. The connect function itself, whenever we call it, we're specifying the configuration for this Redux connection. So that's these parameters to this function. But then we can use that configuration for multiple components. So in this case, we're just using it for the name input. But if we wanted to, we could take the return value of this connect call, and we could call multiple components, and all these components could potentially use the same connect configuration. So our connect function actually has to return another function, which is the function that takes the component that should be connected and returns the wrapped component. So there's going to be a lot of functions at play here, but it's pretty easy to think about it logically. This is the connect function that takes as parameters the configuration for the Redux store connection, and then it returns a function that takes the component that should be connected as a parameter, and that returns the wrapped component. So here we're actually returning a component. So we can just return a component like so. So we're going to need to insert a bunch more code here, but we can, just for now, we can render a component this way. React is not defined. We can fix that very easily just by importing React from React. And let's see where we're at now. Okay, we have this input field. We can actually type into this input field, and the reason we can type into this input field is because we're not passing a name or an onChange name prop into it. So the input field that our name input component renders has undefined as the value and undefined as the onChange. And so the React is just treating it as a normal input field. So what we need to focus on now is getting this map state to props to function properly. So we're going to end up passing in props here. So let's make sure that any props that get passed in from the outer component just automatically get spread into the wrap component. And then we're going to have to do some work to get the state props. So we need to take this map state to props function, and we need to call it on the current value of the Redux store state. And that's going to get us our state props. So we can call map state to props on state. So we don't actually have state yet. We need to make sure that we have access to that. But we do have state props. So let's go ahead and do state props this way. So now we have our props that are being passed in from the outer component being spread into the wrap component. And then we have our state props coming from map state to props being spread in after that. Now, how do we get the current value of the Redux store state? Well, we're going to import, we need to import the React Redux context from React Redux. Now, this is a React context, and so we can consume this context to get the value of the Redux store. And if we go here to our index file, this is actually where we're providing the value of the store to the React Redux provider component. And so the React Redux context is a consumer for that provider. So what we can do is consume that context to get the value of the store, and then we can call getState on the store, which will enable us then to call mapState to props on the state, and then pass state props into the wrap component. So in order to consume the context, we can use React's useContext hook. So we can do const store equals useContext React Redux context. That will get us the store. And then here we can do store.getState. All right, what's happening now? GetState is not a function. Maybe this needs to be destructed. There we go. So to summarize, we've imported our React Redux context, which is a consumer for the React Redux provider, essentially enabling us to get access to the store. The store has a getState function that we can call to get the most recent value of the store's state. We then pass that to mapState to props in order to get our state props, and then we spread those into the React wrap component. And so that means that this function here is running, and getName is being pulled out of Redux state and is being passed to the underlying component. However, I can't type into this component because we have not taken into account map dispatch to props yet. So let's do that next. In addition to state props, we now need dispatch props. So dispatch props, and then we need to obviously grab this parameter here, map dispatch to props. And dispatch to so map state to props is a function parameter, but map dispatch to props, as you can see down here, is an object parameter. So it would be really nice if we could take this object parameter and just spread it straight into the component, like so. Let me get rid of that, and let's see what happens. Unfortunately, that doesn't work, and the reason that doesn't work is because if you look at what the name input component does with the onChange name prop, it calls it with the value of the input field. So calling this function needs to result in a dispatch to Redux. So it's not as simple as just calling this action. This is an action creator, and when this gets called with the most recent value of the input, that's just going to produce an action, but that action needs to be dispatched to Redux. So our dispatch props has to be a little bit more complicated. We need to take the entries of map, no, object.entries of map dispatch to props, and we need to reduce them because each entry, instead of just being an action creator, needs to be a function that dispatches. So we can reduce like so. And if you're not familiar with the reduce function, it's really useful. You should go read about it. I actually have a blog post about it that I'll link to. Okay, so the reduce function takes as its first parameter the collector, and as its second parameter whatever the current value of the array iteration is. So we're going to get a prop name, and we're going to get a action creator. And so the reason we're going to get a prop name and an action creator in an array here is because object.entries produces an array of arrays from the object that gets passed to it, where each element of the array is an array containing two values, the first one being the key and the second one being the value. At the current value for each reduce iteration is going to be the prop name and the action creator, because the keys of this map dispatch to props object are prop names and the values are action creators. Okay, the next thing is that we need to, our collector is going to start off as this empty object, but on each iteration we'll add to the collector whatever the prop name is, and this needs to be a function that dispatches to Redux. So we can just spread the arguments in here, and we can then do store.dispatch, and then we'll call our action creator here in the dispatch, passing in the arguments. And then we'll spread our dispatch props in. The reduce function needs to return the collector for each iteration. Okay, so the problem here is that when I'm typing into the input, it is in fact dispatching our change actions, and the Redux store is getting updated. But what's missing is that this component currently has no reason to re-render when the Redux store changes. And we need to make sure that this component re-renders when the Redux store changes in order for the new name value in the store to get propagated down to the input field. I thought initially that use context would trigger a re-render when the store changed, but it actually doesn't, because we're not grabbing the contents of the store with use context. All we're getting is the store itself. So we actually need to subscribe to the store's change event, and then we'll be able to trigger a force update of this component when the store changes. So we can make a very simple use force update hook like this. It does use state and then returns the second parameter, or the second value of the array that gets returned. So let's import use state. Got auto imported, that's nice. And so now use force update can be used to get a function that when called will force re-render the component that it is called in. It's similar to this .force update in a class-based React component. So over here I can do force update equals use force update, and now whenever I call this function, all of this component will re-render, which means that we'll get the latest state props from the store, and then we'll re-render our wrapped component, which will then re-render the input field over here. So now we need to make sure that force update gets called anytime the store changes. And so essentially what we need to do is subscribe to the store's change event, and the way that you do that with a React function component is through use effect, because we need to subscribe to the store but also unsubscribe when our component unmounts. So we call use effect, and we'll pass our effect function, and we'll pass empty array as the dependencies. This indicates to React that this effect should be active throughout the lifetime of the component, but should get cleaned up when the component unmounts. If we had a reason to clean up the effect and reinitialize it during the component's lifetime, we would put the conditions for that in this dependencies array. But in this case, that's not an issue. So if we just take a quick look at Redux API over here, we have store, and we have this store.subscribe function that we're going to use. Here we go. So we can just call store subscribe and pass our change handling function that will get called anytime the store changes, and then conveniently store.subscribe returns the unsubscribe function, and we need to make sure this unsubscribe function gets returned from our effect in order for the subscription to be removed when our component unmounts. So for those of you that are familiar with useEffect, the return value from useEffect is the cleanup function. So we can do like unsubscribe. Actually, you know what? Let's just copy and paste this on in. Const unsubscribe equals store.subscribe handle change. Okay, so I do need to move the store up above so that it's in scope whenever this effect runs. And now, what do we want to do when the store updates? Well, we want to force update. So we can just pass our force update function into store.subscribe, which will make sure that the component re-renders when the store changes. And now we're supposed to return unsubscribe here, but since this is the only thing that our effect is doing, we can just return store.subscribe, which will ultimately return the unsubscribe function from the effect. Now, I feel like I know what this is going to be. Yeah, so there's some sort of linter active here that's causing us, yeah, here we go, React hooks exhaustive depths. So it's saying that we should put force update and store as dependencies to this effect. I actually do agree with that. Force update is guaranteed to not change because it's the setter function returned from a use state. But if for some weird, strange reason, even though it's really unlikely, this store changed, we would actually want this effect to clean up and reinitialize. So what would happen if the store changed for some strange reason? The unsubscribe from the previous effect would run, and then the new effect would get set up, and we would subscribe to the new store, which is exactly what we want. And that should be it. Let's see what happens. Okay, so I ended up figuring out what was wrong with our force update. And by ended up figuring it out, I mean that I didn't figure it out. For whatever reason, that little quickie force update that I pasted up here didn't work. The use force update library, however, does solve the problem. So instead of defining our own custom little use force update, I'm now using a use force update from a library, and everything else is exactly the same. Whenever the store subscription fires, force update gets called, which re-renders the component. And now we can see that this is back to functional again. Hello there. So that's all. It wouldn't really take a lot more time for us to add merge props in here, but I'm going to skip it because it's not really quite as exciting as map state to props and map dispatch to props. That is how you create a very simple connect function. We covered several interesting topics. We wrote a higher order component. We used some hooks. We're consuming a context that's exported by React Redux. We're subscribing to a store directly using a use effect and cleaning up when appropriate. We're transforming the map state to props and map dispatch to props parameters into state props and dispatch props, which we're then spreading into our wrapped component. And as a result of all of that work, we can now use our custom connect function as if it was the connect function that's implemented by React Redux, and we get the exact same behavior, although definitely less optimal. So I don't think that this solution would scale to a large complex application, but the point was to demonstrate how it could be implemented and hopefully introduce you to some concepts and show you a nifty little implementation that I thought of. And that's it. Thanks everyone for watching. Let me know what you think, if I rambled on too much, if it was informative, anything else that you'd like me to talk about in the future. or anything else that comes to your mind.